Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Panel 1, The Rise and Failure of Britain's Imperial Reform Project. My name is Jim Hrdlicka. I'm an assistant teaching professor here in the History Department at ASU, and delighted to be at this wonderful conference, a collection of amazing scholars of the period, and we have 3 of them up here. I'll just be moderating the panel. But I'll first introduce our panelists. To my right, first up is Brendan McConville, who is professor of history at Boston University. He's the author of several books. I'll just mention his book, The King's Three Faces, The Rise and Fall of Royal America, 1688 to 1776. To his right, we have Rachel Banke, who teaches at the University of Illinois Laboratory High School. Rachel got her PhD from Notre Dame and is working on a book project, Bute's Empire, Reform, Reaction, and the Roots of the Imperial Crisis. And finally, Patrick Griffin is Madden-Hennebry Family Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of several books as well, and I'll just mention The Townsend Moment, The Making and Unmaking of Empire in the 18th Century. So each speaker will have 20 minutes to talk, and at the end of that, I might have a comment or a question just to get the discussion going, but then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers after that. So without further ado, Brendan will give his paper, The Struggle for Imperial Constitutional Reform.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and I would also like to thank the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership and Will Hay for organizing this conference. It's really quite a great event, and it really is bringing together some interesting people. By February of 1789, Benjamin Franklin could clearly see the end of his days. His astonishing achievements were already becoming distant memories when he wrote to Dr. Richard Price, the famed English preacher and radical intellectual, that as we draw nearer to the conclusion of life, nature furnishes us with more help to wean us from it. Death was approaching, and he had come to a moment of self-reflection in one way or another that engulfs all people in that moment, I think. In his letter to Richard Price, if his letter to Richard Price is any indication, as astonishing as it may seem, this particular founding father wished, I think, at the end of his life that the revolution had never occurred and that he had remained a British colonial. And even more amazingly, he seemed to take pride more in or have more hope for the instrument of government that he helped create that was not adopted, rather than the state and federal constitutions that he played a role in creating that were adopted. On reflection, he wrote, "It now seems probable that if the foregoing plan, by this meaning the Albany Plan of Union of 1754, which he had taken the lead in designing, a plan to reform the imperial institutional structure to enable defense against France and her allies, and other things, had been adopted and carried into execution, the subsequent separation of the mother colonies from the mother country would not have so soon have happened, and that he thought was a good thing. Indeed, Franklin believed the mischiefs suffered on both sides might have put off until a latter century, and that too was a good thing. The united colonies, he speculated, would really have been sufficient to their own defense, and thus an army from Britain, I quote, for that purpose would have been unnecessary. The extension of the British financial structures to the colonies, the state financial structures, as embodied in the Sugar Acts, the Stamp Act, and the other revenue acts, and I quote, would not have existed, nor the other projects for drawing a revenue from America to Britain by acts of Parliament, which were the cause of such terrible expense of blood and treasure. As Franklin knew, the plan had failed. It was, he remembered, unanimously agreed to by the Congress, but it died in the imperial political bureaucracy. I quote, "The Crown disapproved of it for having too much weight in the democratic part of the Constitution, and every assembly as having allowed for too much prerogative." I've returned to this particular letter many times over the last 20 years, and I'm sure I've used it somewhere before. There were literally, though, I think it is representative of something that Franklin knew about the history of constitutional thought in the 18th century Anglo-American world that we have largely forgotten. There were literally hundreds of plans like this for an institutionally altered or reformed British Empire floated in between 1690 and 1783 that seemed to offer a path to an alternative America and an alternative British Empire. Taken together, these plans amounted to a separate political discourse in the empire operating with distinct political and social assumptions. These plans, relatively speaking, have not generated a great deal of historical research. I would note that two of the best studies of individual plans or planners, one by my co-panelist Patrick Griffin in his book on the Townsend Moment, and the other was done by Gettysburg College professor Tim Shannon on his study of the Albany Plan. Both were written by doctoral students of T.H. Breen, which I now call that the Breen School of Imperial Reform Studies. There are, of course, others. Ned Landsman wrote a very good article about the relationship of the Union of 1707 to later efforts to reform the empire. John Shai has that interesting small piece in A People Numerous and Armed that many of you have probably seen about the sort of dinner with Henry Ellis and Thomas Pownall. I have a chapter in my book, The King's Three Faces, on the plans in the provincial period, based on my reading of about 35 of them. And also some of Jack Green's students have addressed this issue in one way or another in their scholarship. But overall, the genre itself is strangely understudied, and I'm slowly working on a book on this with a co-author called Rewriting the Empire, about the whole idea of imperial institutional recreation and the genre itself, how it was written. So I think it is something, it tells us something very, I think, unique about what was happening in the empire across the span between 1690 and the outbreak of the War of the American Revolution. Today, I want to explain the origins of the plans floated to reform or reconstitute the empire during the imperial crisis, how they seem to have changed during the crisis, and why that support never gelled behind any of these efforts. As Jeremy Black mentioned in his talk, a lot of people didn't want the American Revolution. There was a lot of interest in avoiding it, and there were plans being floated to reconstitute the empire, but nothing happened. Why? By the time of the imperial crisis, Britain's political class had long thought about the empire's institutional structures, and they had plans readily available, some penned by very leading figures, intellectual figures, political figures in the empire, including Franklin, of course, that considered reforming or altering the empire institutionally and constitutionally. And when the crisis intensified in 1774, the London authorities, and indeed most among the colonial leadership, wanted a peaceful solution. They did not want American independence. They did not want a war. And I think that most people on both sides of the Atlantic would have accepted some kind of changes in order to avoid it. But the real constitutional restructuring never gained the kind of support in that moment that was necessary to answer the problems of the moment. The only plan that really gets anywhere, which of course we treat with kind of disdain, is the Galloway Plan, which comes within a vote of gaining at least support in the Continental Congress, in the first Congress, but that of course fails too, and almost certainly would have been rejected in London, I think. There were, I think, three primary reasons, conceptual issues at work that inhibited imperial reform and a kind of constitutional reordering. First, the plans as a genre, which I think they were, I think of them as a form of political philosophy, obviously, with characteristics at times borrowed from the emergent genre, the particular type of emergent genre of satirical novels, in a weird way. They originated in the imperial wars between Britain and France and their allies that began in 1690 and didn't really end until Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. The plans written between 1690 and 1763 reflected the imperatives created by that long war. They were a response to the war, and as the empire expanded, which is another thing Professor Black mentioned, as it became geographically expanded, the problems of trying to reform it expanded because you were dealing with more actors and more people and different cultures. It became quite difficult. But they were really designed to create centralized control for reasons of military defense. The norms of the genre, of that genre, were carried into the plans that were written to try to resolve the imperial crisis, which was really a crisis that demanded different kinds of reforms and different kind of thinking. And that was part of the problem. The one genre that they had, which was based around the idea of restructuring the empire, was not available to them intellectually to help solve the problems that they get after the 7 Years' War, because the issues had changed, but the genre itself was still stuck in those sort of norms and tropes that it was using. Second, many of the plans for reform seemed to threaten this glorious revolution settlement of the idea of the ultimate sovereignty of the empire being in the king and parliament. It was this question that had torn the British Isles apart in the 17th century, and they desperately did not want to reopen it. Of course, that issue helped intensify the imperial crisis itself. Where was sovereignty located? I think that discussion was already ongoing, and that there were people in Britain already asking questions about that were leaving a lot of people uneasy. Even about the question of sovereignty, about the character of what the British Constitution was, that issue had emerged and was already being debated just within the British Isles before Americans started making the claims they did in the 1760s and 1770s. If I saw the title Jack's Talk, and I assume that this is related to it, that there's an ongoing dialogue about where is sovereignty rightly located and why. It goes on, and it's really in the British Isles as almost like a separate discussion, as well as within the empire and the colonies, and between the empire, imperial center, and the colonies. Finally, I think the plans for reform engaged this dangerous question of exactly what the British Constitution was, what its intellectual substructure was, what institutional forms it could legitimately take, who could generate those institutional manifestations and under what circumstances, and whether its essence was common to the empire as an entity, was it common to its component parts, was it sort of carried within individuals as part of this package of their notion of their rights and liberties. What was it? The imperial wars created the need for centralized imperial institutional coordination. The wars created intense financial imperatives to remodel the state, leading to the creation of this fiscal state, which has been studied by John Pocock, Linda Colley, Joyce Appleby, John Brewer, others. But paradoxically, these changes rested on a Protestant political discourse that was extremely libertarian for its ideology. In a sense, the empire rested on that sort of paradox. On the one hand, they were creating a state that was centralizing and militarized. On the other hand, the legitimization of the regime was a libertarian discourse. And that created a kind of strange dynamic in that question of what the British Constitution was. I think it was a more brittle structure than we realized, although some of them thought that or knew it as well. The plans to restructure the empire appeared as a kind of specific genre, as I said, in the 1690s. Incidentally, among those early plans, they appeared during the 9 Years' War, what we colonialists used to call the King William's War. There were a series of plans in the 1690s for imperial reform. I won't go into any of them, although I will say that I think that the plan of 1696 is written by John Locke. And I have reasons to think that, which I won't go into now, some other conference. I would also add, as another aside, that they appeared, the plans, at the same time that the nature of political discussion and political thought in the empire changes. Political satire appears in a certain form. You can see this connection, say, in something like Gulliver's Travels, where he encounters people with different political forms, political organizations. The early plans for imperial reform reflected the overriding military concerns and the ideological tensions, I think, in the empire at that time. You can see that they make an effort of this when they joined Massachusetts and New York under one governor in the 1690s, under Bellomont. There's other efforts as well at that time. But if we leap ahead to the Albany Plan of 1754, we can see this. We can see that it's really quite British. It was true that the Albany Plan transferred some responsibilities to the colonies in regard to defense, but in a manner that imposed a hierarchical, centralizing structure on British America that would have enhanced imperial control, not diminished it. The colonial assemblies would have lost power and prestige to this new centralized imperial body, and their already truncated control of their money supply would have disappeared with it. Truncated, of course, because of the suspending clauses and the imperial restrictions on paper money. But simply put, from the 1690s to the end of the 7 Years' War, the overwhelming tendencies in the plans was to restructure the empire, was to call for a centralization of power and control. This would have come at the expense of the locales for the sake of defense from external enemies, which they were all afraid of, the French, the Spanish, the Native Americans. It would have created a kind of centralized, anglicized structure in the colonies one way or another. But if you begin to think about that, of course, that's not going to work in what happens after 1764. There's no way forward from that. If you look at the plans of the plan of William Vaughan, which is in the New York Historical Society, it was written in 1769, there's a new article out about it, and the guy says, no one's ever cited this thing, but I actually cited this thing in 2006 twice. But no one else knows. It is funny, but it's a good article. It's in Early American Studies on Vaughan's plan from 2021. While Vaughan realized that one of the issues was the colonists wanted more self-rule, his solution was to impose more hierarchy and control. He advocated for creating an American kingdom, sort of on the model of Ireland. And with its own governor general or viceroy, a bicameral parliament, Anglican bishops atop a new church establishment, and otherwise recreate what they had in Britain. By the time Vaughan was writing in 1769, the issues could no longer be solved by simply situating a British-style institutional structure in the colonies. What might have worked or might have been considered in 1754, although I think Franklin was right that the colonial assemblies didn't want it, indeed might have been welcomed at that time because they were afraid. You know, they might have been able to, if they'd had a better plan, would no longer work in a society that was rife with fear about what was going on at the center of the empire. Although plans continued to be offered in the same vein with the same kind of structure right on top would be put down on top of the colonies, right up to independence. And the idea that imposing bishops and an Anglican hierarchy in the American religious landscape amidst this crisis was not rational. It shows you another part of the problem is there's a lack of sort of general understanding. This same tendency towards hierarchy can be seen in the Galloway Plan, which was put forth by Joseph Galloway and others in the First Congress. The plan called for a president general appointed by the British monarch and a kind of super assembly called the Grand Council, elected from the colonial assemblies. The plan was famously rejected by Congress, but equally famously only by one vote, as I mentioned. As late as 1775, the Philadelphia merchant Thomas Wharton wrote that he wished that, I quote, a superior magistrate to that of a governor might be appointed by the king to reside in this continent. This viceroy would, and I quote, act in legislation with a certain numbers of members to be appointed out of each house of the assembly. It would have an upper house and a lower house. He says, I conceive this would have a tendency of checking a turbulent spirit in any one of those colonies and give colonies as well as England as well as the colonies greater security. You can read this in his papers, the Wharton papers, which are in HSP, Historical Society of Pennsylvania. By 1775, though, such efforts at hyper-Anglicization or imperialization were clearly hopeless as a solution to the imperial crisis. But also evident in that genre's imperatives and norms established between 1690 and 1763, they remained in place and were the major impediments, I think, to reorganization. Not only was this hierarchy going to be considered, unacceptable in the colonies, but to create a body in the colonies that would have given them basic autonomy would seem to threaten the settlement of the Glorious Revolution, the settlement of where sovereignty lay in the empire. It was not going to be practical, I think, to the creation of a new institutional arrangement in the colonies, even an American kingdom or a cadet American parliament would in all likelihood have further inflamed this question, which was already rife, of course, in the colonies after 1764. It would have further inflamed the question, not resolved it. The Glorious Revolution settlement itself inhibited the acceptance of any plans of reform in London, even those generated by their own leaders, which some of them are generated by their own leaders. And the reason for that, I think, goes to this question is there was already a debate in the British Isles over that question, which sort of gets washed out because of the way we read the American Revolution, but I think it was already going on. The potential for this problem to erupt was evident in the Galloway Plan and would have probably led, I think, to its summary rejection by the London government, even if it had been one acceptance in the First Congress. The plan's language, which sort of it sort of questions what Parliament's role is in the empire, or its power, or whether this new American body would have equal power. It really does sort of call those things into question, and I don't think there's any way the British Parliament would have accepted it on that basis. So it creates a kind of problem, and it's not a problem they can resolve. It is clear that Galloway knew that the demands to acknowledge parliamentary supremacy in 1774 were completely, in sort of open language, were not viable. As the Pennsylvanian Joseph Reed put it, provincials everywhere had by then contempt for, and I quote, the absolute uncontrolled powers of Parliament, which we all know, and many colonials writers wrote against that, including James Otis, even though some of them wrote that they knew that that was the case, it was supposed to work that way. Otis does this. They were not going to accept it somehow. To try to manipulate the language, or it wasn't going to work. There are, of course, other types of plans, and these became visible to an extent as the imperial crisis intensified. It is clear, as in 1773, 1774, 1775, they were desperate, and they were starting to throw things up in order to make it look somehow to create some kind of plan that they can go forward with. Although such plans that would have somehow incorporated the colonies into the empire, were put forward. One of them, which reads, and I quote, to persuade the colonies, and I quote, to send over a certain numbers of deputies or representatives to sit and vote in the British Parliament in order to incorporate America and Great Britain into one common empire. This is from the the Welsh Anglican cleric Josiah Tucker. The overwhelming view in the American colonies was, if we do this, we're going to be overwhelmed. Even if we all stick together, we'll never survive Parliament. They'll just outvote us and put legislation on us, and it won't vote, or it won't work. A number of colonial writers, when they suggested, okay, you want representation, we'll give it to you, they rejected that, and the most sort of virulent in rejecting of it was Dickinson. Dickinson and Otis both wrote against this bitterly as being kind of like a stalking horse for a kind of tyranny with elected members. It was that they used that phrase, I think. The belief voiced by that particular reformer, Josiah Tucker, reveals that even those vested in the empire knew that its component parts did not at that moment operate as what he would call one common empire. They recognized, tacitly at least, the confederated nature of the empire. Of course, the great political scientist in the 1920s, Charles McIlwain, was the person who first sort of writes about this. They suggested a line of reform somewhat similar to the later British Commonwealth. These people, Tucker even incidentally advocates American independence, but people think, wow, that makes him, he hated Americans. That's like, all right, let's get them out. We must get rid of them. The famed British thinker Edmund Burke also puts forth a plan. It's very much like a Commonwealth type of structure, but it's too late. He starts writing to people about this in 1775. It was too late. And they continued to offer, though, reconciliationist plans, like the plan put forth by Burke, some of the things that's suggested by Tucker, right through the period of the Carlisle Commission, which is having its moment at this conference. The Carlisle Commission has become the center of the conference, in a sense. The Carlisle Commission of 1778, they put forth a plan like this as well, and it is, it's rejected, or, they're rejected, but Congress was nervous about that plan, as several people noted. They did not want the word of that plan to spread in the general population. There was also plans put forth during this time, primarily by members of the legal community among the loyalists. Some of them are brutal. It's to create a kind of totalitarian structure in America. One of the people is David Ogden, the Mid-Atlantic, New York and New Jersey jurist lawyer. He puts through a plan, get rid of the American colleges, get rid of the assemblies, create basically an absolutist state. No one could seemingly conceive of a plan that would have been acceptable right up until the moment of independence. They kept trying, but they could not seem to create a plan acceptable to all parties that did not somehow create a kind of general problem. Shifting to a Confederate model re-empowered the monarchy as the link of the empire at Parliament's expense would have created a crisis in Britain. And even prominent scholars and politicians could not seem to gather enough support to form the empire into one nation, and they didn't know how to exactly reconcile it all. For all these reasons, the failure to reform in the face of the imperial crisis, that failure to reform intersected in this question of what the British Constitution was, which I mentioned earlier. I do not mean this simply in the sense of what was the location of sovereignty, although that had become current, as I said, or of the nature of representation, those two issues we always talk about when we talk about these constitutional issues in the British Empire. In other words, where is sovereignty located, why, and what was the nature of representation and what was its appropriate form. There is, I think, a lot more to it. I think there was a broad anxiety about what the British Constitution was, as I said, whether it was tied to specific type of institutional arrangements, or was it an attitude of set of values with a relationship to the equally ambiguous rights of Englishmen, or whether it could be held by individuals, groups, or nations that were legitimate repositories of those values, or embodied those values, or expressed those values, and whether that would empower those people to act. The plans all raise the question without really providing a viable answer, and it's part of a much broader discourse that's going on in the empire, which isn't just focused on the American question. The broader issues, the nature of the British Constitution, which raising that question about the nature of the British Constitution beyond the familiar tropes and issues we use to discuss it, would make a good subject, I think, for another conference. And the plans of reform and their failures would surely provide crucial material for such a discussion. The failure of reform assured the rendering of the empire, and they are, I think, a gateway to understanding that failure. A gateway to understanding that failure is locked within them as much as it is in anywhere else. Reform itself and its failures is a way of understanding the broader political culture and the broader issues of law, legality, and constitutionalism that were current in which the American Revolution occurred. Thank you.
So my paper is asking the question, whence the crisis? Where does this crisis really begin? As the conference title tells us, the answer is 1763, of course. The war impresses on British politicians both the importance of the American colonies, but also the burden these have posed. Britain spends enormous expense fighting what we call the French and Indian War in the Americas, and globally this war almost doubles the British debt to a total of almost 133 million pounds. So by the standard narrative, during the 1760s, this new generation of British administrators seeks to fix the financial burden of the North American colonies. And we do generally focus on the taxes as key to this story, right? There's something of a drumbeat propelling each new chapter. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act continuing through that familiar string, the Townsend Duties, the Tea Act. But part of what I want to talk about today is that focusing on taxes alone really misses the foundational ways that the British Empire was reshaped during this period. And depending on how exactly we count a single reform, I see about 8 distinctive American reforms from late 1762 until 1765. And half of these were defensive, the other half were fiscal. So that's a lot of reforms, right? And I'm not going to go through each laboriously. But which was most important? The easy answer is all of them. And there's evidence for this, right? The famous list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence calls out George III for the decision to maintain 10,000 troops in the colonies after the war. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. They go on for imposing taxes on us without our consent, like the Stamp Act, for cutting off our trade with all the parts of the world, right? The Revenue Act of 1764, among other things. And we could go on like this. But answering the question of what begins with the imperial crisis and saying, like, it's everything is unhelpful. And it's also untrue in important respects. So instead of looking at 1776, I'm going to take us back to the era when these decisions were first made and implemented in the colonies. As we've already established today, 1763 was a victory, and colonials delight in it. They're celebrating George III's birthday. They hang portraits not only of the king, but the queen and the prime minister in their homes. They toast to the good health of key British political figures. That doesn't really look like a crisis to me. So I'm going to look today at the earliest heads of government that George III picks for himself. And as Professor Black has mentioned, the turnover here is very, very quick. Not quite the lifespan of a head of lettuce, but close to it. So in 1761, George III appoints the 3rd Earl of Bute with the top job. We would colloquially call them the Prime Minister, but in reality it was the First Lord of the Treasury in these days. And then in 1763, Bute resigns and Bute-Grenville takes up the position. Because of this quick turnover, scholars often amalgamate this early Bute-Grenville moment of reform from 1763 to 1765 as something of a coherent chapter. This is the end of salutary neglect and the first steps toward making North America a revenue generator, rather than a liability for Great Britain. All of these reforms are also in some way kind of dealing with the legacies of the 7 Years' War. But Bute and Grenville had actually very different approaches and priorities. And at the same time, it's also important to remember reforms are coming from other people in this moment, the king himself, other government officials, and various, sometimes self-appointed colonial experts and agents. So it's under Bute that the defensive reforms are taking precedence. And these begin not in 1763, but actually in 1762, while the treaty is still under negotiation. War is the most expensive thing that early modern states could do. And Britain had already fought 4 major wars against France in the last century. As we've been saying, they anticipated the next one. So what Bute reasons is that if we never get in another war, that saves us the debt, right? So defense is in some ways a cost-saving measure so that they don't take on more debt. And Britain needs troops to assert sovereignty and defend the thousands of miles of new territory that it has gained. George III plays quite an active role in this particular reform. He is, as we've been saying, this enlightened monarch. And he and Bute agree that a larger American army had become necessary from, they write, our successes. And so they decide to keep 20 battalions. This is something like 10,000 officers and men in North America and the Caribbean. Now, the cabinet also agrees to a general understanding that America would be paying its own troops. They're looking at the budgets. They see no way of expanding the army without having payments come from elsewhere. But they're in the midst of an enormous logistical challenge of moving a global army around in the 18th century. And they're focused on the logistics. Where do you station these various battalions, regiments, that sort of a thing. And so they leave the financial details unanswered. They say, America will pay for its troops in a future year. The end. Now, we'll return to that in just a second. But the decision to keep a large standing army in the colonies is initially uncontroversial, which is perhaps surprising to us today. But these troops are stationed across the Caribbean, Florida, Louisiana, Canada, and colonials on the eastern seaboard have little reason to think about the troops that are thousands of miles away, at least until they're asked to pay for them. Right, in 1765, then they question them. But they're still questioning it on the principles of cost and necessity, rather than viewing this army as a tool of despotism. Now, Bute, it turned out, wasn't well cut out for the Treasury. He faces this crisis around the Cider Act, and he suffers a physical breakdown, resigns. But as he's resigning, he sets in motion several other key reforms, which relate to the defense of this expanded empire. He installs his protege, the Earl of Shelburne, at the Board of Trade and Plantations. This advises on colonial affairs. And the board with Shelburne at its head is instrumental in shaping the proclamation of 1763, which is most familiar to us for the proclamation line. But it also sets up new governments in these territories. Colonial governments are established where there are significant populations, but it places vast reaches of the interior under military authority. And an often overlooked aspect of this decision is that there's a permanent commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America who becomes responsible for both military and civil government in those regions in the West. And again, we might expect this centralized military authority to cause problems. But the commander-in-chief shows surprising restraint, and he remains pretty widely popular among colonials until 1774 or so. During the Stamp Act crisis, for example, he refuses to use troops without proper authorization from civil authorities and works with colonial governors to de-escalate the crisis. So Bute and his appointees are largely responsible for the major defensive reforms of this period. These structures later become critical points of colonial grievance, particularly with the coercive acts. But for now, the effects are largely removed from those colonials who are living on the eastern seaboard. The problem, the thing we put a pin in, was how would Britain pay for this expanded defense? And so after Bute resigns, George Grenville becomes responsible for the financial reforms of this era. Now, just an aside, I'm feeling a strange camaraderie with Grenville right now because I'm at this lovely conference with all these excellent speakers. And like Grenville, I don't feel terribly confident myself. Grenville was known, and this is a direct quote, for being an unpleasant speaker who is diffuse and argumentative. And one of his most important speeches in Parliament that I'm going to talk about in just a minute lasts over 2.5 hours. And I just hope I'm not boring you as badly as Grenville. What's interesting about Grenville, though, is that he thinks about economics quite a lot differently than his predecessors. One of Grenville's colleagues later and kind of famously writes that Mr. Grenville lost America because he read the American dispatches, which his predecessors had never done. And there is some truth to this idea, right? That Grenville seeks out experts, he checks the records, he actually demands that his subordinates and that customs officers are in place doing their jobs, which is unusual. But here's where I think he's notable. He remembers that he's dealing with people who behave in a logical but often predictable ways. He understood that social pressures and fashions drove clandestine trade in luxury goods, and then it was hard to police illegal trade, particularly far away in America, because smugglers were supported and protected by their communities who benefited from their work. And any informers would be socially ostracized. And furthermore, people were biased to prioritize their own immediate self-interest, rather than any notions of broader ideas of economic prosperity. And these ideas are, in essence, the foundations of what we today call behavioral economics. They're developing more broadly in the 18th century with figures like Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham. And Grenville's never going to go down as a great economic thinker. But I argue his ideas belong to this kind of general trend. He makes explicit attempts to understand and address the psychology of revenue collection and to change people's behaviors by structuring his measures in ways to account for human fallibilities and encourage compliance. So in this almost 3-hour-long speech he gives in March 1764, Grenville clearly states his intentions to, quote, reconcile the regulation of commerce with an increase in revenue. Grenville's laying down the line here that becomes very important. He's not just taxing the colonies to regulate, but to raise new revenues. He proposes the Revenue Act, which includes what we now know as the Sugar Act. And during the same speech, Grenville also proposes the idea of a future duty on stamps in America. And perhaps everyone's just relieved this marathon speech is over, but Grenville gains the applause of the whole House and Parliament's assent for these ideas. So when he goes to pass the Stamp Act in 1765, which he and his associates are kind of creating basically from scratch, right? There's stamp duties in Britain, but they're creating these new duties for America. His work is really to set the rates. He's already gotten a whole room of people to remember that they've assented to this idea in theory at the very least. And so as colonials begin to lobby against the stamp bill and to propose alternatives, it's already something of a done deal. Grenville already has that assent. And so, to Grenville, this Stamp Act is something of a perfect measure, right? He's already done the hard work of the politics. He sets it up in such a way that it's pretty much self-enforcing, right? If you don't get your paper stamped, your property or your business represented by those papers is in jeopardy. It's collected in such a way that it doesn't require many customs officers. And so even as the whole continent is engaging in protests and violence against the Stamp Act, Grenville believes his measure is perfect. He goes so far as to say he wishes it had more faults than it had. So that it was because of a logical problem with the tax, not just as a result of American violence. So, kind of by way of conclusion here, colonials don't see a crisis in 1763, right? Many of these early reforms go by somewhat unnoticed. It's in 1765, as Grenville has constructed and passed this tax almost too cleverly, that colonials are left without really legitimate options of resistance. Their choices are to resist the stamp papers and to chase out the stamp collectors themselves, and of course they do that. And as the events of 1765 bring clarity to the changing imperial relationships, colonials return to the reforms that they had ignored just a few years earlier. So suddenly, the 10,000 troops become a grievance, as colonials are asked to pay for it, and as they fear that the redcoats might be used to enforce the use of stamp papers. Moreover, the Stamp Act asserted a clear precedent of Parliament's authority to tax that colonials had been willing to overlook in some of the more incremental reforms of 1764, even with the Sugar Act. Some colonials see that that's an intent to tax, but they moderate their critiques of it. And so, by way of conclusion, let me just give you one kind of final example here. A colonial satirist, who was likely Ben Franklin, responded to Grenville's reforms with a series of mocking hints, which is again this kind of genre of political writing, to support, quote, the economy at present so much in vogue. The piece satirically suggests raising a force of Canadian and Highland troops to enforce the Stamp Act. And this encapsulates everything: the 10,000 troops, Grenville's taxes, the proclamation of 1763, all of it. Such a force, the piece claimed, would subjugate America, and this is a quote, in so cheap a way of going to work that even Mr. G.G., George Grenville, this great economist, could have no reasonable objection to it. So whereas these reforms had emerged piecemeal in sort of two different chapters, a Butite chapter on defense and a Grenville chapter on economy, colonials by late 1765 and certainly by 1766 had begun to understand a coherence where there really hadn't been one in British policymaking that threatens, and again a quote, their constitutional rights. Thank you.
It's quite an honor for me to be up here next to a number of people that I really like and admire. People like Jim and Rachel, I've known them for a long, long time, and it's great to be on the same stage with them, and even people I have to put up with like Brendan McConville. I want to thank Will for this invitation. You know, Will, it's funny, but if you come to a conference where the Carlisle Commission almost becomes an inside joke or a meme, I think it's time to start looking to retirement or something like that. But it's great to be here with everybody and with so many old friends. So we were asked originally to talk about this kind of this period of time from 1763 to 1775. And we who teach American history regard this, certainly in my field anyway, as the most significant question that there is. How we get from 1763 to shots ringing out in 1775. How we get from a moment when Americans were thrilled with the idea of being considered as Britons, indeed, as some people have written, they were the most British people in all the world, to the point where they're actually going to be taking up arms against that empire and then a year later declaring independence. Like I said, it's the most significant question we can answer. And in this audience alone, we have a lot of people who've addressed that in many different kinds of ways. So what more can I say? I don't know. There's probably not much more I can say. But instead today, I want to think about why we're drawn to it. Why we're drawn to it. And I think it's because we're all enthralled with the tipping point. And that's what I want to discuss today, the idea of the tipping point. It's what we assume, but usually never dissect. I'd like to dissect that a little bit for this particular moment. I think the idea offers an interesting way of us to think about how we get from 1763 to 1775. And as we're going to see, I would argue anyway, that among historians anyway, there's a broad consensus about this answer and about what the tipping point is and what it represents. But more importantly, the tipping point helps us actually see what people who were living in that period from 1763 to 1775, how they thought about things and how they started to conceive of their past, their presence, and also their future. You see, ultimately, I think we're all people of the tipping point. Now, when I say the tipping point, invariably you're probably brought to this book that you might be thinking of that probably many of you have probably read. You know, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this back, I think it came out about the year 2000 or so, and it was one of these things that you would find in every airport around the world. And the tipping point was really a simple sort of idea, and he was fascinated by how things become fad-like, how kind of social phenomenon can be kind of, in many ways, likened to viruses, how something viral happens at some moment and what was just an idea then becomes something else that can ultimately transform a society and transform a culture. It had a lot of purchase at that time. It's got some criticism, that's for sure. But it was one of these kinds of things that the tipping point had its viral moment as well. It became a viral meme in many kinds of ways. He also proffers a bit of an answer for the American Revolution from 1763 to 1775. Gladwell says, well, the answer is Paul Revere. He said, Paul Revere is a perfect way of understanding how a tipping point works. He said, because this guy is what he called a connector. He has this thing called the kind of the law or the rule of the few, how it's a few key individuals are the ones who can actually make a society tip from one thing to another. And he compares him to William Dawes, who was another one of those midnight riders. Dawes was not a charismatic character. He didn't have a big social network like Paul Revere did. And because of that, then, Dawes is someone we don't think about that much. And of course, everybody knows who Paul Revere was. Now, I'd imagine things are a little bit more complex than this when it comes to tipping points. But as I say before, even though we can poo-poo this idea, and certainly his interpretation of the American Revolution when it comes to Paul Revere, this is something that most historians buy into. And so I'd like to talk about first the historians before we get to the people themselves. I'd like to do so by going through a few books, if I can get this thing to work. There we go. Of three people who happen to be in this audience. Okay? So what I did is I did a forensic kind of look at three books, and by the way, three of, I think, the best books that come to for studying this period of time and understanding what the heck was actually going on. And I just want to show you that three authors involved assumed this idea of the tipping point as you start to dig into it. First one on our left is Brendan McConville, The King's Three Faces. So Brendan up here offers us a look at kind of American society in this period of time where he says these people, if you will, are enthralled by the idea of patriarchy. They are bound to the person of the king. And that when Parliament is going to pass legislation that we've heard about already, they're going to see the king as a protector and ask the king to take up what his accepted and normal role in society. And as he puts it then, 1773 is when it all breaks down because Americans begin to appreciate that the king is not acting as the protector. That's the tipping point. When we get to that moment in 1773, and more or less the scales fall from their eyes as they become to realize, and that's what it is about, it's an epiphany, a realization at that moment that the king is not going to perform his accepted role. Similarly, the middle there, Lige Gould, The Persistence of Empire. He also looks at revelation, revelatory moments. And he says, he doesn't agree with McConville on 1773. He argues it happens a little bit earlier. For him, the break occurs in 1768. As these first acts are passed by Parliament, the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, it reveals, as he puts it, fundamental tensions within the empire. And it leads to an extraordinary debate on both sides of the ocean. And people on both sides of the ocean begin to understand that the center cannot hold. And by 1768, it is clear, there's clarity after this moment of revelation that it's not going to work. In this way, he goes back to an earlier generation of scholars like Bernard Bailyn, like John Shai, who we've heard about just before, and even Edmund Morgan, talking about, if you will, kind of a revelatory moment that's going to lead to a logic of rebellion that's going to lead inexorably to a break. But that's when the moment occurs. Finally, we have Jack Green, and Jack offers a very sophisticated understanding of the tipping point, because for him it's actually not one but two tipping points in this book. As he said, it was Parliament that was kind of imbued with this notion of imperial grandeur, was going to try to proffer for Americans a centralized understanding of empire. That was going to be very much based on the language that Brendan was going to talk about, but that Americans are going to use that self-same language to push back against them with ethical claims about what Parliament can or can't do, because Parliament's not allowed to trample on rights. This is only going to lead to further exacerbation as Britons now are going to clamp down. As he says, this begins to happen from the very get-go, but it's in 1776 when the break occurs. But as I said, for him, it's a double tipping point, because he says what we need to understand then is what happens in 1776 leads to a reconsideration of the period just before. And Americans begin to think 1766 is when it all went to hell in a handbasket. That's when everything tipped. They were enthralled with this idea. So even though these three scholars don't, if you will, consciously or intentionally bring us to tipping point, it's more or less the idea that they subscribe to. We see it in other works as well, consciously too. A book that's going to come out later, that's going to come out in the 2010s, 1774, by Mary Beth Norton. Well, it does what it more or less suggests on the tin. What it's going to say is that it's in that year, that long 1774, between the Tea Act and then between, if shots ringing out at Lexington and Concord, it was events that were going to lead inexorably to the tipping point. She doesn't use the term tipping point, but that's what the book is intentionally about, and how 1774, everything is going to break in that moment. She doesn't disagree with Brendan at all, or with Jack, or with Lige on, if you will, these underlying things that are going on. But for her, it's events, dear boy, events that are going to make everything happen, and that's for her the tipping point. She's writing in the 2010s, and this is an interesting difference between her book and between the three that I had just mentioned. She's writing during the 2010s because she says, I'm writing now during a period of intense political conflict, as she puts it, in polarization. And that reminded her, if you will, of this particular period of time. So she was looking through the own prism of her own moment and saying that there's something analogous there as well. She went a little further and she said, you know, I started to want to do this book, 1774, in 1972, when there was even greater political polarization in America. So even though it's about the 18th century, in many ways it's inspired by what's going on in the 20th and then the 21st century for her. So I say it's not only these, it's others as well. If you looked at a couple scholars that understand the American Revolution from a dramatically different perspective than the scholars I've just talked about, you see the same thing at work. Okay? You see it at work with Rob Parkinson's book, The Common Cause, with Woody Holton's book, Liberty is Sweet. These are kind of taking the perspective that the American Revolution was not only about home rule, but was also about rule at home. Was about these people, if you will, kind of excluding certain folks, and I'm thinking we have the best book on exclusion is actually Craig Urish's book. That's extraordinary, and both of these books I think are in debt to because of his understandings of the way kind of exclusionary languages are put in place when this crisis is set off over home rule. But it's going to be the rule at home issue about Americans are trying to make sure that they can maintain their privileges of sometimes lording it over others in their own society once this happens. And both of them subscribe to the tipping point moment. They look at different periods of time to do it. Woody's is like 1775 with Dunmore's proclamation. That's going to be the tipping point when it happens. For Rob, it's going to be earlier. 1773 is when he's going to see that tipping point moment. But interestingly, like Mary Beth Norton's book, 1774, they are consciously thinking of tipping points because of the political moment they're writing in. They're both writing in the 2010s. And they're both kind of informed, their opinions are being informed and shaped by what's going on in American politically, and so they are much more avowedly looking at this kind of idea that most historians more or less assume. When we look at the tipping point itself, if I can get it there, if you interestingly look at the tipping point itself, and this is what some critics had to say about it, they said at the time when Gladwell wrote his first book that he was writing during a moment that many considered a hinge period or a tipping point in history. He was writing during the period of the Clinton presidency when people were wondering what the post-Cold War world was going to look like in the wake of the Gulf War, when there was so much up in the air, but yet there was hope that Americans were going to be able to transition to a new way of self-understanding at this moment. And some people said, did anybody ever notice that he's writing about the tipping point during a tipping point? There's nothing about that in his book, but they said it's more or less kind of the backbone to everything. Later on, much later on, during a more dark period of time, a darker period, he's going to write the son of the tipping point, and that's going to be the revenge of the tipping point. The revenge of the tipping point basically doesn't say that the first one was wrong. He's going to say, I'm doubling down on it. Except it's a lot of bad things happening. We want to talk about the opioid crisis. That tipping point explains that. If you want to understand about kind of political populism, tipping point can explain that. And of course, if we want to talk about COVID and the responses to it, the tipping point can do that. The tipping point doesn't only work for more hopeful periods of kind of liminality. It also works for darker periods as well. But of course, he was writing during a very dark period. And now he's much more conscious of that as he's writing this second book. I think what it points to, what kind of the Gladwell's perspective points to, is that maybe we shouldn't just be looking at the historians who have kind of written on this and assume or are kind of intentional about using tipping point. Maybe we should look at the people themselves. And if we do, what we find out is very instructive indeed. In the period of time that we're looking at from 1763 to 1774, as we've heard already, when Jeremy's talk was very, very good on this, it was a period when people just didn't know what was going to be happening, but everyone understood or appreciated that this was a momentous moment. It was a moment of great anxiety on the one hand, it could be a moment of great hope on the other hand, but people living at this period of time believed they were living during a historical period when things could potentially change. It could go downhill. It could potentially go uphill. The British themselves were using these templates of the past to try to understand this period of time. And they said, maybe, remember what happened to the Roman Empire, but maybe we could do what the Romans weren't able to do. Maybe we can create an empire that is premised upon the notion of liberty. They hadn't been able to, but maybe we can actually do it. And certainly Americans also are involved in this notion of a tipping point moment, intentionally so. We see it in all kinds of ways. We see it in, for example, the belief in conspiracy. We see it also in kind of more subtle ways. For example, in the 1760s and in the early 1770s, there's a rise, if you will, in the number of ghost stories that you find published in newspapers. Why the hell is this? Ghost stories of all things. Ghosts become appearing here, there, and everywhere. The ghost of Oliver Cromwell is coming out telling Parliament what it should and shouldn't do. The ghost of General Wolfe is appearing talking about paths that were not taken. There's going to be ghosts from the time of the Boston Massacre who are going to be appearing asking for revenge, but also saying what has happened to the British Empire. Mercy Otis Warren is going to talk about ghosts and said in 1774, there's a mania for ghosts and devils and witches that's here in Boston. It clearly has to do with the present political moment. That's what she says. And indeed, she is right. That's what's happening. Ghosts talk about paths not taken. Ghosts talk about kind of what should have happened but did not. Ghosts talk about the idea that history has somehow gone off track. And if you will, they are symptoms to a deeper malaise and anxiety that people are experiencing in the moment when we went from the hopeful tipping point, when we are going to be Britons and the future is going to be great for all of us and America is going to be part of it, to the darker revenge of the tipping point when everything seems to be going south. It's not only ghosts as well. A recent book has just come out that's talked about actually the mania for Milton's Paradise Lost among many Americans, but also Britons too. Thomas Paine loves Paradise Lost. So does Thomas Jefferson. He said that Thomas Jefferson's enthralled with the notion of Satan in Paradise Lost. better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It's about different kinds of ways of conceiving of sovereignty during a moment like this when things are up in the air and people are wondering when history is going to turn, when it's going to shift and change, and how we're going to relate to all of that. The person who wrote the book said it didn't only happen at the time of the American Revolution. Every moment like this that's a tipping point moment is when people time and time again would look to Milton. And of course they would, not only to Milton and to Satan, but they would look particularly to this and to 17th century examples. And this is the reason why I think Americans go back again and again and again to the 17th century in order to understand what's happening to them in the 18th century, is because it's at exactly the same kind of tipping point moment that people are struggling with when they're not understanding what the future is going to hold and they're suffering through a moment of anxiety. The languages of the 17th century are well attuned to that, and they are adaptable to the 18th century, to this sort of liminal moment as well. So it's not only kind of we up here, the folks who are going to be talking now, who kind of are indebted, believe it or not, to Malcolm Gladwell and to his idea, but more importantly, it's the people that we study. At these particular moments in time, they're the ones who pretend to become the Malcolm Gladwells. They are indeed the people of the tipping point, and I was arguing no matter what date we're going to look at, no matter when we say the tip is going to actually occur, it's when you understand this and untangle it and dissect it, rather assume it, is when you can understand this transition from empire to revolution that was going to mark those years 1763 to 1775. Thank you very much.
Am I on now? Okay, good. Well, thank you all very much. That was just wonderful. I'll try to pose a couple general questions that try to tie these things together and just get us started on a larger discussion. For Brendan and Rachel, maybe we can I have a question that might tie your presentations together a bit. You talk a lot about reform plans from the perspective of either Imperial, the sort of perspective of the Imperial Center, right? Officials in London imagining how the colonies could be different. Although, Brendan, you also look at plans produced by people in the colonies imagining how reforms could take place. And a general question I have for both of you is, to what extent do you think these would-be reformers take into account American opinions and interests? That is, was there any thought to whether the Americans to whom these plans would apply would realistically embrace such reforms, that these would actually advance their interests? I'm struck by, I've done some work on the Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was among the people most foremost in arguing for Parliament's authority in a theoretical sense. But even he makes comments with regard to what ought to be done with the colonies along the lines of, well, we might have the right to do this or that, but would it be expedient to actually do this? That is, I'm thinking of something Professor Black touched on too, which is early modern governance does not have coercive power in the way, say, a 20th century totalitarian state had some kind of totalitarian power. That is, even plans that are, we would designate as sort of imperialistic or centralized, or we use terms like that. What does that mean in practice, though? Absolutist France, as Professor Black was saying, isn't all that absolutist in how it functions. Still less British America. How any of these people would think that Americans would comply with these plans that they're sketching out. The other thing I'm struck by, too, is a number of these plans seem to me very schematic. That is, either they're written by one person or a group of people, and they can be pretty elaborate. Nonetheless, they never get to the stage where they're actually attempted to, be put in place at a level of detail that actually takes into account the demands that Americans would presumably make of them. Think of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and the records of that convention, or any constitutional convention. A lot of details get worked out. These plans don't just get to that level of detail. That brings me to Patrick's discussion of tipping points. And as a number of speakers already have said, Americans don't want to, Brendan said this, Americans don't want to break with Britain. Many of them don't. Even people who become revolutionaries. Ben Franklin, I guess, has second thoughts in retrospect. And that question seems to be relevant for this question of tipping points. And as Patrick, you were saying, different historians point to different things about what is a tipping point. And you speak of kind of a sort of revelations, or some kind of revelation that people have about, I guess, the notion that the status quo can't remain, something is going to have to change. I guess this does tie back to my thinking about the sort of specificity of reforms. And I guess the question about tipping points is, when people have a revelation, they actually need something tangible to do, like a plan to accomplish, to institute that. And so you can be upset that the king, well, it doesn't seem like he's going to be protecting us any longer. Well, you need something to put in place, don't you? And so how does that factor into our understanding of the coming of the American Revolution, some kind of tipping point, the causes of the American Revolution, and what ultimately plays out? So those are general thoughts that I hope if you'd like to respond or just keep them in mind as we have our discussion. I don't know.
I think a couple points on that you've raised. Would the plans have been embraced by the colonials? And of course, there is a broad variety of these plans, some of which are quite crude, it's just things sketched on a napkin type of thing. Some of them are much more elaborate. Some of the things that are discussed in conversation and then written down in letters to people. And I think it depends. In 1766, Pownall and Franklin talk about, like in conversation, about extending using the colonial legislatures as sort of extensions of the British Treasury and using them as loan offices and incorporating them, which would have stabilized the currency. It would allow the empire to have had an inflated currency backed by gold, with the Bank of England acting like the Federal Reserve Bank. And look, a lot of colonials would have gone for that because the boom and bust cycle created by the emissions of paper money and then their contractions had ravaged the colonial economies repeatedly. And on the other hand, I think it would have been extremely tough. I mean, because the papers were so condensed, or mine, I could have gone on for hours, but mercifully I did not. They put these hierarchies, plans for hierarchies, both generated by Americans and by British Americans and by people in London and other parts of Britain. There was no way that most colonial assemblies would have wanted those things, because if they put a hierarchy on top of them, they were going to lose, and they were going to feel like we're going to be eliminated or worn out. They would have seen it as a step towards absolutism, even before the Revolutionary Crisis. I do think it's interesting you mentioned Hutchinson in these plans. Hutchinson is seen as the second author of the Albany Plan. Yeah, and I mean, it is interesting, all the more ironic because, of course, when it's the publishing of the Hutchinson letters that gets Franklin kicked out of Britain, and it really is when he comes to his turning point is until he's kicked out and he realizes there's no going back. So that's how I would just describe in general. But I do think this issue of reform, they all knew, even colonials on the basic level knew that the empire, it had changed, it had grown, there were issues, but they couldn't seem to get enough momentum together, as you say, to get some kind of achievable goal into the system. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to the question about kind of reformers taking into account kind of colonial interests, it's striking just how different Bute's papers are from Grenville's.
Yeah.
Bute is corresponding with army officers, with military officers. He's getting sort of intelligence from them. And he does, in a kind of paternalistic way, for example, take strong account of what the Catholic Canadians would want from their new government. But Grenville, he is corresponding with customs officers. He takes a couple who kind of become his chief advisors, people like Henry McCulloch, who used to be a land commissioner in the South, and they become sort of his informers on all the ways that Americans are smuggling, are circumventing various laws. And so these couple of guys become the creators of particularly the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Now, these are Grenville's pet projects. Interestingly, he sort of outsources some of the things that he finds less interesting. And this is how Parnell and Franklin also become key in developing some of the compromises around the Mutiny Act. So he's both kind of incorporating colonial ideas, but also holding them at arm's length in decisions like how he passes the Stamp Act, where he kind of makes it a done deal, and he makes a show of meeting with colonial agents. And he actually sounds pretty personable in these meetings. They come off like feeling like he understands, but really he's not doing anything about it.
Jim, those are two really good questions, the one that you posed to Rachel and to Brendan, and the one you posed to me. I'll just briefly add about the first one that these two folks just weighed in on. It strikes me anyway, and Rachel, you just talked about kind of the French-Canadian thing, because they will indeed, I think, treat French Canadians with kind of, if you will, a greater sense of perspective than necessarily will, because of fears, and that's because of fears of France returning and everything like that. So that's going to be one thing. But when it comes to Americans, I guess for the most part, they're much better at kind of reacting to Americans when it comes to repeal of acts than it comes to enactment of those acts. When it comes to enactment, I think the best example of that is, of course, you've heard of the difference between internal and external taxation, right? So in the wake of the Stamp Act, before the Townsend duties are passed, et cetera, et cetera. And Charles Townsend is famously going to say, that's an absurdity. It's an absurdity that there's going to be any distinction between them, and no one over here really believes that. We'll just kind of say it. But we're going to do what we want to damn well do anyway. It doesn't matter. But they're going to pay attention to them when it comes to the repeal. When the second question you had about like how these, so if there's a general sense of, if you will, discontent, how then is that focused on, if you will, like things like, for example, that Brendan would write on the person of the king and everything like that. I do think, and this is kind of almost an old-fashioned literature, but I do think to a certain extent that some of the older stuff is indeed right, that there are going to be certain individuals that will indeed play catalytic roles and are able to see and crystallize exactly what is happening. I'm very cool. You have Jane Calvert here in the audience who knows more about Dickinson than anybody and has written better about it than anybody else. But Dickinson, I think, is one of these characters who understands the zeitgeist of the age and understands what's going on. And in the wake of the Townsend duties is able to put his finger on it and say, this is what's going on. This is happening. And it's amazing to see how that sets off a reaction, almost a chain reaction. And again, I'm looking for a metaphor that works. But it sets off a chain reaction. And you can follow that through how this is kind of his farmers' letters are going to be printed and reprinted in so many different newspapers up and down the seaboard. There's something about what he's able to do and to kind of to put a finger on what's going on. He kind of plays that role. There's going to be other people. I think Samuel Adams plays a similar kind of role too, particularly in Boston. But it's some of these kinds of characters that are able to kind of appreciate what's going on, and maybe to a certain extent, certainly Dickinson did. If there's anybody who understands the tipping point, it's going to be him. And he's writing the farmer's letter saying, we've reached it, and this is it. We've come to a new kind of understanding of empire. We don't like it.
In that same vein, if you look at the statement of Patrick Henry in the First Continental Congress, when he debates with John Jay, and he says the empire is essentially collapsed and all distinguishing aspects of it are thrown down. Even the boundaries between colonies and property boundaries are thrown down. And of course, a lot of people at that point don't agree with that, but they're all thrown into a state of shock because somebody is crystallizing the moment. The other thing I would say, which is related to Patrick's about this, is if you look at stuff like the town books in New England, even Bob Gross's study of, which many of you know, the Minutemen and the World of Concord, everything's going along in these towns. They're arguing over firewood. Somebody's hog got loose and ate some stuff, and all the different stuff. Suddenly, at the end of 1773 and the beginning of 1774, people start saying something like, we better start training harder, and we better get some guns. If that doesn't tell you that they think there's a problem, when you start saying, let's get some guns and some gunpowder, usually that's a sign you think there's a problem. And that happens actually even before the Tea Party, but as the tea crisis is unfolding in the fall of 1773, when they start to think something's wrong. We may have to fight. Even though, as several speakers, and I think Jeremy Black noted, a lot of people in the colonies were also thinking, Boston's crazy again. They've destroyed the tea, they're crazy, they're doing crazy New England things. But it is strange that a lot of the New England town books and meetings, they start to talk, in the meetings of the town, they start to say, we better get some guns, more guns.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions, so if anybody would like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone.
Okay, so I really enjoyed all three of these papers immensely, and I started thinking about this question, Brendan, when you were talking, and then it just sort of seemed to go across all three of them. One of the distinctions that separates, Patrick, the earlier works that you talked about from the later ones is, of course, the later ones focus intensely on issues around slavery and the slave trade. And
Yes.
I'm wondering where political economy discussions of slavery and the slave trade are fitting into these projects for imperial reform, how much they are filtering through these efforts at reform. I think it was Molly Perry I heard recently talking about the timing of the Stamp Act, being based around making sure that the Caribbean islands could get fed, and the question of a tipping point being sort of hinged to questions about the stability of slavery across the empire, and of course the core problem that the laws about slavery were of course local, and colonies were intensely jealous of that local protection. But of course the transatlantic slave trade requires imperial control and had been sort of centrally focused on during the 7 Years' War as well. So I'm just wondering how that question fits into these various paradigms.
I think that one thing, having read these plans, and I have to be frank, most of these plans don't discuss it. And I do think that because we've gone through now a long period where there's been a long period of work on slavery and the issues of anti-slavery and other slave trade, in my mind, and as cynical as this sounds, which it is, because of the nature of the trade, although there are people who question the trade, there are people who champion the trade, there are different, but most of the time in terms of the issue of slavery, the two things that come up is, how can I exploit them to the maximum, meaning the enslaved people, and how do I control them and avoid, and I do have a theory about this, which is that during times of imperial warfare, there's intense concern. During times of imperial peace, in that long period of war between 1690 and really, going into the period of the War of the American Revolution, at times of peace, the planter class, and for that matter, imperial administration, either they don't discuss it all, or in the case of planters like Landon Carter, they try to convince themselves, well, my enslaved people see me as a patriarchal, benevolent patriarchal figure, and it's, this is the kind of the way this relationship works. They're trying to convince themselves of that. When the wars come or moments of tension come, like the imperial crisis, they're forced to admit to themselves, my enslaved people hate me and probably want to kill me. And so it goes back and forth, sort of their view. Of course, the enslaved people, their views are, quite, different from that. But it's amazing in these plans for imperial reform. I scarcely can remember any discussion of the slave trade or enslavement. There is a lot of discussion about Native Americans, and that's a different issue. But there's a much more intense discussion about the fate of the Native American nations. But it is not an intense discussion of enslavement.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rachel.
I was going to say, I think Blash also has something he wants to say in there. But slavery, really, I just kind of second all that. It appears shockingly little in some of these plans. And part of what Grenville thought was so amazing about the Stamp Act was that it was perfectly equal, right? And they'd done a bunch of research on all the various duties, and that it was fair because it applied evenly in North America and the Caribbean. But of course, people in the Caribbean owned far, far more property. And so levying whatever the duty was on a particular legal document was, proportionally a far smaller amount of a Caribbean slaveholder's, profits or whatever. But in terms of the actual human beings, even in terms of the political economy, there's relatively little thought about it.
I don't want to preempt Professor Gould because he's probably going to ask what I'm going to say, I bet. And that is going to be the one thing I can think that actually where slavery is going to play an important role when it comes to a kind of imperial governance and thinking about it would be free ports in 1766 and 1767. And if anything, this isn't to so-called regulate the slave trade or regulate kind of the production of what slaves are going to be producing. It's going to do just the opposite. What it basically is, it's to free up those places to actually kind of trade more freely across imperial lines, you know, and so it's going to fly in the face of, if you will, what you know, Jeremy was talking about when it comes to a mercantilist understanding of empire. This is where you're actually going to have, it's almost like Adam Smith of Vaulette, what you're going to have at this particular moment when it comes to the Freeport Act, but it's going to actually deal with the issue of slavery. But beyond this, I mean, for the most part, my colleagues are indeed right. You don't see it very often discussed much.
The one exception I can think of to this is, I want to say it's in 1774, and I think it's David Hartley. I'd have to go into my notes to get specifics, but it's a proposal for Parliament to enact a law governing sort of the humane treatment of enslaved people that all of the colonies will register and agree to. And Franklin's involved, and the idea is that that will be how they show their acceptance of parliamentary sovereignty while dodging the question of taxation. And it doesn't really go anywhere, but it is a very interesting moment, and it kind of because it doesn't go anywhere and it's a one-off. I mean, I think it speaks to what you're talking about, Brendan, but there is that one exception, and it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, that is true, and I have seen reference to that. So I would say I agree with that statement, that there is a moment there where they do. But I do have to say that the notion of humane slavery seems to me a contradiction in terms, basically. I mean, right.
It strikes me, going back to what you said, Brendan, when you were talking about kind of the languages that are being used to kind of ostensibly being used for the planning of reform, how on one hand they can lead to kind of oppressive measures. On the other hand, though, people understand them in kind of almost a libertarian kind of fashion. I think when it comes to the issue of slavery in the empire, it's almost they lean toward the libertarian sort of understanding of what it is. Let these slave owners enjoy their rights.
Right, which they see as part of a folder of property rights in the exploitation of property.
1763 is, in fact, very important for the British Empire in their acquisitions. And the majority of those acquisitions are in the West Indies. And there's careful planning about how new slave areas are going to help the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And when you get down to it, I mean, the real tension about slavery is between those people who do have humanitarian conceptions of it and the other people who realize how powerful an economic engine it is for the British economy.
Yeah,
that's why it takes so long, really, to eliminate the slave trade after it's brought up intensively in the early 1770s by Granville Sharp and
Granville Sharp is the first one.
And other people, and why it takes even longer to ever actually abolish slavery itself, and then paying a big price for it.
Sharp is the only one of them that when the question was asked that leapt to my mind. He's the only one who really who immediately leads to mind. Who really he penned stuff for imperial reform, and he also, as you say, he calls for the end of slavery. But I would say this, Jack, is that as you say, they see it more as this is a new way. Of course, you get sugar islands. It's going to enhance the economy of Great Britain overall. And the real issue of imperial integration with those islands and with Quebec is over the fact that the owners and the residents who are free are Catholics, and this creates a problem of absorption. But you're right, Granville Sharp does discuss this.
Yeah, just this plays out also in the Floridas, where there's this, it kind of prefigures early 19th century American kind of trends about, do we allow slavery to expand into the Floridas? There's some utopian schemes for free labor in the Floridas, but ultimately the sort of governor, the people in power, lean very hard into the profitability of slavery.
Because of what happened in Georgia, which they saw as a model,
Yeah.
and because Georgia had tried to exclude slavery.
Well, we have just a few more minutes here, but
Yeah,
let's
but
go.
I would just add one more thing
All right.
quickly, if I could. And that is, I think Jack's point is very important for us to kind of appreciate as we're thinking about this moment in time, too. We can become fixated, if you will, on kind of the 13 mainland colonies. That's only half of the colonies. And the most important ones by far are indeed going to be in the Caribbean. As you put it, you're exactly right. This is the engine room of empire. This is where the commerce is, this is where kind of the money is going to come from. And because of that, getting back to Brendan's point, that's why these French planters are going to be accorded, even though they are Catholics, they're going to be accorded their full rights. They're going to have the full rights of kind of an Englishman here in the Caribbean and allowed to kind of enjoy and to be tolerated in the enjoyment of their religion. And that is very different altogether. And it goes back to Kate's point at this question, of course, just let the planters be. Let them continue to make the money. That's going to be the important thing.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, all three. Having given so much time and energy and thought to these catalytic people and events that, and in retrospect, in hindsight, looking back, do you find yourself in today, like this age, your lifetime, looking at things or finding common threads where you can say, I see this happening, I see this person, I wonder if this is going to change or this is going to change something? Do you find yourself looking through that lens in our current day and in your current life?
No. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't. I try not to read too much of then into now and now into then. I think that there's been a lot of that, and history has been is now often being used that way. But I don't see them. I see it as a different error. I mean, I would like to, there is somebody who reminds me of Lord Bute, but I won't go into that, So needless to say, I would just simply say I try not to do that consciously. No doubt, unconsciously, perhaps I am doing.
Yeah, certainly it echoes, right? And writing this paper talking about, Grenville wanting customs officers to return to their positions. Even small details like that have some echoes. But again, trying to not lean too hard into that.
I think it's a great temptation. And it's not only kind of a temptation on the part of historians who kind of know a great deal about the stuff that happened. I think it's a very human temptation. We are embodied mortal creatures. And because of that, we tend to think about the periods of time that we're living in as the most significant, when things are dramatically going to change. That's natural. And I think you see that through every generation. That's heightened at certain periods of time, that's for sure. Just like I was talking about before, when people are very conscious, or they think they are, they imagine they're living through kind of a hinge moment in history. It's amazing to see, like when you read the newspaper every day, how kind of we're being told that we're living during a hinge moment in history as well. I would just say that perspective urges us to tap the brakes a little bit and realize this is a very human temptation to think about kind of our lives that way and the moments in time that we happen to live that way.
I would just finally say to that I think history, we often think of history, how do we apply it, like we find someone, as you suggest, but I think that the power of history is that it teaches us to think about change in a general way in the past without trying to make it of now. And when we do, we sort of lose a little bit, I think, of its specialness and sort of the nature of their lives and how different they are. It's like a foreign country, but it's a tool thinking about how societies change and the changes of a historical epoch. That's a powerful tool thinking about life in this time or any time.
Well, we have to leave it there, but we'll reconvene at 2 p.m. and please join me in thanking our panelists.